The last 50 years of the history of the great powers have afforded an unusually large role to the region of Central Asia. The region has appeared unable to shake itself free of great power attempts to dominate and steer the course of the region's history. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 attempted to secure the influence of the Soviet Union in the region, while the United States and its ally Pakistan put rifles into the hands of the Sunni Islamist guerrillas who opposed them. In 2001, the United States' own invasion, backed by its Western partners, attempted to oust the Taliban after 9/11 in an attempt to protect itself from Islamic terrorism. It began a 20-year insurgency and state-building enterprise, only to end with the Taliban victorious and back in control following a hasty US withdrawal. To Afghanistan's northern borders, and now released from the yoke of Soviet domination, the Central Asian republics remain key to Russian geopolitics, as it attempts to dominate energy and mineral exports, whilst trying to prevent any degradation of its sphere of influence by China or the United States. Meanwhile, the US and its allies continue to contend with Iran over its nuclear program and limit its global and regional influence following the overthrow of the Western-friendly Shah in the 1978 revolution. Though the Soviet-Afghan War and the subsequent War on Terror are often cited as examples of superpower rivalry driving conflict, they are merely the latest in a long line of conflicts stemming from foreign interest in the region. Central Asia is no stranger to the predations and intrigues of great powers, and it was here that the world's two largest empires engaged in a struggle for dominance over the passes, deserts, and peoples for the entirety of the long 19th century. This vast chess match, stretching from Persia to Turkestan to Tibet, has become known in English as the Great Game, a term popularized in Rudyard Kipling's Kim. To the Russians it became known as the Vojna Tenier, the War of Shadows. But just how did great power rivalry affect the course of history in Central Asia? More specifically, how did Britain's ostensible rivalry with Russia affect British policy in the region and drive British expansion, both territorially and politically? By the beginning of the 19th century, the British East India Company had expanded its influence over the vast majority of the Indian subcontinent, either through direct rule or through assuming suzerainty over nominally independent polities known as the princely states. A great source of wealth to the British, India was in time to become known as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. It is no surprise, then, that the British were keen to ensure the security of this most lucrative portion of their vast colonial holdings. They had good reason to be worried, as covetous eyes in both Paris and St. Petersburg were eyeing up India and its riches. Indeed, a military expedition to India by the Don Cossacks was dispatched by Tsar Paul in 1801, which was only prevented by the Tsar's assassination, a fact that became known to the British only years later. A pact between Napoleon and Paul's successor, Alexander, to divide India between them was reportedly forged at secret talks in 1807. However, by 1812, the Napoleonic Wars were beginning to reach their climax, and it was therefore a considerable relief to the British when Napoleon invaded not India, but Russia, turning on his erstwhile ally. In the light of Napoleon's subsequent defeat in the harsh Russian winter, and Tsar having been transformed from foe into friend, the threat to British India appeared to have evaporated, though such peace of mind was not destined to last long. In 1817, merely 2 years after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, a tract by veteran military commander and Member of Parliament Sir Robert Wilson was widely circulated in British society. In it, Wilson warned against the rapid build-up of the Tsar's forces and expansion of Russian territory over the last decade. He claimed the Tsar was a potentially larger threat than Napoleon had ever been, and that inebriated with power, Alexander's goal was nothing less than to fulfill Peter the Great's wish of universal domination, by seizing first Constantinople, then India. Wilson's claims, whilst outlandish, were afforded extra weight by the fact that he had had close contact with the Tsar when seconded to the Russian army. Wilson had even been afforded a knighthood from the Russian sovereign. His polemic is an early example of the distrust and competition that would permeate relations between Britain and Russia throughout the Great Game. Wilson himself was to be merely the first in a long line of British politicians and political and military officers to raise the spectre of the Russian boogeyman, and to warn of the Tsar's ability and desire to extend his influence at the expense of Britain and its empire. It is this mixture of paranoia and geopolitical rivalry in the East that has led some to contend that the Great Game was a period solely of British history, and not international relations. However, these real security dilemmas would lead them to tangle in the affairs of states that they otherwise would have had very little interest in. If there was a threat to India, from Russia or anywhere else, it was imperative that the British government attempt first to identify and then counteract any tactical vulnerabilities or enemies that might threaten the security of the British in India. The first potential threat to India was of a seaborne invasion. This was, after all, the same way that the British themselves had come to dominate the subcontinent. However, during this period of Pax Britannia, the Royal Navy dominated the sea lanes, and so any power attempting a naval invasion was unlikely to have any success. That left just a possible land invasion over the mountain passes to India's northwest, through which many an invader had come throughout India's history. There were essentially two routes through which an invader from Europe could approach India. The first was directly eastwards through the Middle East, proceeding through the domains of the Shah of Persia as well as the Ottoman Sultan. However, both Persia and the Sultanate, whilst weaker than Russia or Britain, were practically impenetrable barriers if aided by the other great power. Therefore, as long as the Shah and the Sultan could be kept on their thrones and friendly to Britain, such an invasion through this route was practically impossible. It was this desire to maintain Turkey as a viable deterrent against a common rival that was to eventually lead to Britain's intervention in the Crimean War, revealing the true extent that Great Game principles and anxieties were not limited to the Central Asian theatre, but reached further into Anglo-Russian relations and European balance of power. The second selection of routes, available only to the Russians, contained various permutations, but some critical similarities. It was a southeasterly march through the Khanates of Central Asia and into Afghanistan. Here they had two options. One was to go via Kabul and from there cross the Indus River before pouring through the Khyber Pass into northern India. The second was a more southerly route through Kandahar and then through Baluchistan and the Bolan Pass, approaching India through a more westerly direction. What both these routes had in common was a reliance on marching through the territory of the Afghan tribes. A third route, should Russia gain the support of the Shah, along the Persian coast was considered unviable due to its proximity to the sea, and thus the guns of the Royal Navy. The key, therefore, to any defence of India lay in controlling the entrance to the passes along what was known as the northwest frontier. The approach to these passes lay in Afghanistan, and thus it was crucial for the British to extend their sphere of influence to cover these regions. It was even more crucial to keep Afghanistan out of the reach of the Tsar. It was this strategic imperative that was to trigger the First Anglo-Afghan War. The immediate cause of British anxiety was the city of Herat in what is today northwestern Afghanistan. By the late 1830s, the city of Herat had been independent from the Shah's domains for nearly 40 years. However, the new Shah had never surrendered his claim to the city, and in 1837 set out with an army to bring it back under his control. Russia at this time was enjoying good relations with the Shah, and thus such a fertile and prosperous city as Herat falling into the hands of Persia was as good as giving the Russian sovereign himself an operating base from which to strike at Afghanistan proper. Indeed, the city had been dubbed by some in the British establishment as the gateway to India. The strength of Russo-Persian relations was soon apparent as Count Simonich, originally present as a military advisor, began to lead the siege after the initial Persian efforts were frustrated. The British military officer, Lieutenant Eldred Pottinger, was leading the defences of the city, was a fitting, if accidental, riposte. The hero of Herat, as he was to be hailed, had been in the city to reconnoitre it for the government. In the face of the danger to Herat, Kolkata acted decisively. Firstly, they dispatched a naval force to the Shah's coastline and bombarded his coast before seizing Karg Island. The Shah was informed that if he continued to lay siege to Herat, he risked war with Britain. Secondly, the British resolved to remove Dost Muhammad, the then ruler of the Emirate of Kabul, and install the previous ruler, Shah Shuja Durrani, as a puppet. Despite Dost Muhammad having supporters within the British establishment in India, who believed him to be a potential reliable ally, his recent attempts to play the Russians and British off one another alienated the British, and they feared that Russia's influence was becoming dangerous to their interests. This was complicated further by Ranjit Singh, ruler of the Sikh Empire and British treaty ally, rivalry with the Emir. It was in the face of a potential catastrophe of a Russian-aligned Kabul and Herat that a British expedition set out for Kabul. The Herat situation soon resolved itself, as the Shah heeded the British threats and withdrew, much to the chagrin of Count Simonich. However, the British were now determined to secure Afghanistan as a proper buffer state between India and Russia and Persia. Lord Auckland, the Governor-General of India, wrote that he intended to
raise up an insurmountable and I hope lasting barrier to all encroachments from the westward, and to establish a basis for the extension and maintenance of British influence throughout Central Asia.
However, this initial foray into forward policies was to end in signal catastrophe. The First Anglo-Afghan War was initially a great success for the British, as they captured everything in their path from the Bolan Pass all the way to Kabul. Upon reaching it, they discovered the emir had fled to Bokhara, and the city surrendered without a fight. Shah Shuja was placed on the throne, and the war appeared to be won. This was only amplified when Dost Muhammad handed himself over to the British. Their victory, however, was short-lived. Although the bulk of the army of the Indus returned to India, a number stayed on as a garrison. Shah Shuja's unpopularity, combined with the outrage of foreign infidel soldiers occupying their city, spurred the Afghans to rise up in an effort to drive the British from their land. A bungled and indecisive defence by the elderly General Elphinstone and Sir William Macnaghten led to an undisciplined retreat back through the mountain passes. Reneging on an agreement to allow the army to retreat unmolested, the Afghans, led by Dost Muhammad's son Akbar Khan, massacred the British as they marched through the passes, firing on them from above. The most famous moment of the whole debacle was the last stand of the 44th Foot, the last remnants of the army, as they seized a hillock and fought to the last man. In the end, of the 16,000 troops and civilians that had left Kabul, a single British soldier, a surgeon by the name of William Bryden, and a few Indian sepoys made it back to British India. Their first forays into Central Asia had been a dismal failure, and the First Anglo-Afghan War came to a close. The British failure in Afghanistan was to have a marked effect on their policies. They first went about attempting to restore their prestige by initiating a limited punitive expedition against the Afghans. They then seized the independent states of Sindh and Punjab, though the move was not entirely supported by everyone involved. It has been suggested that Sindh and the Punjab were victims of British need for a victory in Central Asia, so as not to appear weak and thus improve Russia's bargaining position with the independent states. Former Governor of Bombay, Mount Stuart Elphinstone, described the British advance thus:
It put me in mind of a bully who had been kicked in the streets and went home to beat his wife in revenge.
Whilst the leader of the expedition and eventual conqueror of Sindh himself, General Napier, considered that the British
have no right to seize Sindh, yet we shall do so, and a very advantageous, useful, and humane piece of rascality it will be.
However, with Britain's military, if not moral, prestige re-established, the British seemed now determined to leave the affairs of the Central Asians to themselves. They abandoned forward policies in favour of what became known as masterly inactivity. Meanwhile, Anglo-Russian relations began to warm, and a decade-long period of détente ensued. It came to an abrupt end with the advent of the Crimean War. It was hoped in Britain that the end of the most unnecessary war would chasten the Tsar and cease his expansion into Central Asia. The opposite was to be the case. The first post-Crimea threat came not from the Russians but the Persians, as the Shah again attacked Herat after it was seized by Dost Muhammad, now back on the throne of Kabul and virtually the whole of Afghanistan. This time, the Shah succeeded in capturing it. Once again, the British proved that Afghanistan was their red line, and the capture of Bushehr forced the Shah to withdraw and surrender all claims to the city. Again, the British were determined to treat Afghanistan as a buffer. Determined to secure their frontiers, the Russians began a rapid push into Central Asia. This was often done through the individual actions of Russian commanders in the field, overstepping their official orders, though tacitly approved of by St. Petersburg. Though Britain launched its protests, it had its own problems to deal with. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, or Sepoy Mutiny, was to prove a greater threat to British rule in India than the Russians ever were. Taking a year to defeat, the mutiny led to the transfer of company rule to the Crown, and tied up British attention in India for a number of years. In the meantime, Russia began its rapid expansion. Having crushed the remnants of the independent Kazakh tribes in 1847, the Tsar's forces could now move further south into the Khanates of Kokand, Bokhara, and Khiva. Over a 10-year period, the Russians subdued vast swathes of Central Asia. In 1865, they launched a campaign against the city of Tashkent, subjugating the Kokand Khanate. In 1868, the Russians captured Samarkand, annexing the city and turning the Emir of Bokhara into a Russian puppet. In 1873, they captured Khiva, and another Khanate fell under the power of the Tsar. The final peace was achieved when Kokand, rebelling against its overlord, was crushed, and the city of Kokand itself was brought under Russian control. By now, Russian advances were straining Anglo-Russian relations to the breaking point. The Russo-Turkish War of 1878 was to prove a precipitating flashpoint and the quintessential case study of how Anglo-Russian relations dragged Central Asia into war. With the Russians having essentially defeated the Turks in the field, the British once more resorted to gunboat diplomacy, preventing the Russians from seizing Constantinople at the risk of war. Predicting the outbreak of open hostilities, the Russians dispatched an army, 30,000 strong, to march through Afghanistan and, after winning the support of the new Afghan Emir, Sher Ali, march on India. In this game of diplomatic chicken, the Tsar balked and acceded to British demands. However, the Governor-General of Russian Turkestan, Kaufman, was not to be put off, and forced the Emir via threats to receive him and his mission and sign a treaty of friendship between Afghanistan and Russia. A Russia-aligned Afghanistan was a strategic nightmare for India, and those tasked with its defence could not allow it to stand. Viceroy Lytton, hawkish at the best of times, dispatched a mission to Afghanistan which was refused entry at the frontier. Lytton now gave Sher Ali an ultimatum: receive the mission and apologise, or there would be war. Caught between the two empires, Sher Ali dithered, before eventually agreeing to receive the mission. But he had waited too long, and receiving no response, the British had declared war. The Second Anglo-Afghan War had now begun. The course of the Second Anglo-Afghan War was a surprising mirror of the first. The British marched in, sweeping all before them, and the Emir, abandoned of his allies, fled Kabul, dying a few months later. In turn, a British mission was established in Kabul, and Sher Ali's son placed on the throne. Not long after, a populist revolt led by returning Afghan soldiers massacred the mission. A punitive expedition was launched and Kabul was recaptured, the Emir abdicating in the process. The governor of Herat and brother of the recent Emir sought to seize the empty throne, and now launched an attack to drive the British out. However, achieving one of the quickest infantry marches in history, the British army defeated his forces at Kandahar. The British now placed Abdur Rahman Khan, another grandson of Dost Muhammad, on the throne, a surprising choice considering he had been living in exile in Russian Tashkent. However, the Iron Emir was not pro-Russian but vehemently independent, though this was tempered by an agreement that placed his foreign affairs under British control. Essentially, putting him in Britain's sphere of influence. Finally, perhaps, it appeared that British India was secured from external threats. Yet one final major incident was to test the British willingness to go to war in Central Asia. In 1885, 3 years after the end of Britain's withdrawal from Afghanistan, having delayed their involvement in efforts to demarcate the border between Russian lands and Afghanistan, the Russians seized the northernmost Afghan fortress of Panjshir after defeating an Afghan force. This violation of Afghan sovereignty was a flashpoint that nearly brought both great powers into direct conflict, especially since Afghanistan was now effectively the only buffer between Russia and India, all other states having been brought into the Tsar's domains. However, Britain ultimately did not wish to once more go to war in Central Asia, and through the Border Commission agreed to trade Panjshir for a demarcation of the border between the Russian sphere and Afghanistan. This mixture of determination and pragmatism was to prevent further Russian advances into northern Afghanistan, and essentially halt further Russian expansion into Central Asia, and in turn the Great Game. The demarcation signified a final line that the Russians could not cross. To prevent any further flashpoints, the British determined that their empire should not meet the Russians at any point. To achieve this, Britain negotiated its border with Afghanistan, creating a thin strip of land between the agreed Russo-Afghan border and the new Durand Line, demarcating the border with British India. The British paid a subsidy to the Emir for the maintenance of this strip of land, known today as the Wakhan Corridor. At this end of the Great Game, the British and Russian empires stood at some places no more than 10 miles distant. This was in effect the last major confrontation of the Great Game, and it is fitting that once British anxieties had been assuaged and Russian expansion arrested, the story of Central Asia took once again a back seat to the history of the great powers. It is important to see, though, the interconnected effects of the international system on its constituent states, and Britain during the Great Game provides a textbook case. The British were drawn into a number of wars and countless skirmishes and policing actions that were spurred on by direct Russian action or British paranoia and strategic imperatives to protect India. 2 wars with Persia were fought over Herat, a city far from their domains, to keep it from being used as a base. 2 wars with Afghanistan over a mixture of real and perceived Russian interest that required British intervention to protect India's security. Even such acts of barefaced colonialism as Britain's wars with Sind and the Punjab can be seen through the lens of necessitating British military prestige in a region where they needed to be feared and respected. The game's effects are also long-lasting. The borders and demographics of Central Asia were drawn not with the subject peoples in mind, but with the strategic positions and goals of empires. The Great Game has valuable lessons to teach strategic thinkers today about the nature of security dilemmas and political paranoia. It was continuously proven that the British had little to gain from meddling in Afghanistan, but expansion of Russia into Central Asia forced the British into wars they otherwise likely would not have fought. Their frontier policies were always directed with Russia in mind. Their frontier policy was changed in accordance to match the perceived threat of Russia to British rule in India. As Viceroy Lord Curzon himself claimed, "Whatever be Russia's designs upon India, whether they be serious and inimical, or imaginary and fantastic, I hold that the first duty of English statesmen is to render any hostile intentions futile, to see that our own position is secure and our frontier impregnable, and so to guard what is without doubt the noblest trophy of British genius, and the most splendid appanage of the imperial crown."